Mike Stevens?
No, this is Mike Sullivan of Raccoon Valley. Yes, here he comes. Yes, sir, if you would give us your name for the record, please. I've got your name. If you give me your full address, please.
Mike Sullivan, 5506 Raccoon Valley Road, Knoxville. I'm here to talk about protecting our hilltops and our ridge tops, literally. I have a deed that says one of them is mine. I'm here to speak on behalf of those who own those hillsides and ridge tops and can truthfully say they're ours. Let me qualify that by saying I've been asked to speak on behalf of visitors to KnoxCountyPropertyRights.com. So I may not speak for all these property owners, but I speak for quite a few. A couple of housekeeping issues. Using the term plan to minimize the importance of this is disingenuous. This plan will directly affect the prism through which MPC looks at proposals and makes recommendations to this body. It will fundamentally change the way property is developed. This matters. Second, this is a property rights issue. To quote a member of the MPC staff, and I quote, well, duh. We all know it's a property rights issue. We've asked over and over again what gives anybody the right to intrude on property rights like this. And I've gotten a civics lesson. U.S. versus Railroad, Euclid versus Amber. And we get that. This body has the right to regulate. We support that. However, we'd like to say that just because you can, in this case, is not good enough. That power to regulate is granted to you by us. And when you take on that authority to regulate, you have a fiduciary responsibility. Calvin Coolidge said, ultimately, property rights and personal rights are the same thing. When you exercise your power in a way that intrudes upon personal rights, property rights, the right to free speech, you have to ask yourself two questions. The first is this intrusion absolutely necessary? Not because it's cheaper, not because it's easier, but because there's no other way to achieve what must be done. We see this in questions like, is my safety and the safety of airline passengers important enough that we ask people to sacrifice their right to privacy for screening? They're not easy questions, but does this issue raise to that level? Let's decide if the first is true, does this affect as few people as possible and in as small a way as possible? The problem here is that when you attack 62,000 pieces of property, or 30,000, or 15,000, or 1,500, you fail on both counts. You've not visited my property. You don't know what may or may not be proposed. As an example, my property appraisal would go down. I've got a lot of property over 50%. That comes off my personal financial statement. When I go to buy a car, I pay a higher interest rate. If my property never becomes before this body for rezoning, that's unnecessary. As to the second part, there's been a lot of discussion. It's not 62,000 parcels. It's 30,000. Well, if there's 30,000 in here that don't need to be, you cannot make the argument that this affects as few people as possible. We submit to you that be it this plan, an alternative plan, an amended plan, or any legislation that comes before you that involves sacrificing personal rights, that you have to ask, is this absolutely necessary, and does it affect as few people as possible? Regardless of all the other arguments, starting slow, transfer tax, regardless of all these things, you must first evaluate your fiduciary responsibility. If the principle here is flawed, the rest of the issues really don't matter. We are property owners. We ask that you preserve our right to our hillsides and our ridge tops, literally.
Thank you for your comment. Next we have